You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney, with experts and insiders on what you need to know in Northeast Ohio.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm Stephanie Haney. I'm so happy that you're here with me today. We'll be talking about something today that is very personal to me, something that I have some experience with. You know, we've been in this pandemic for a little over a year now, and a lot of people have taken that opportunity to do some thinking about what they want their families to look like, what they want their lives to look like, their relationships. And we've seen kind of some unexpected results, right? We kind of were expecting a baby boom out of this pandemic. We were thinking people were going to be at home more, not so much to do. Maybe they'd be making babies. Well, we haven't seen that yet. We've actually seen a drop in the birth rate. But I will say this, you know, it takes about 10 months from start to finish to cook a baby, right? So there's some time. I know a couple people who are expecting right now, so I'll be interested to see what the numbers are maybe like 6 months from now when we come out of this thing. But in any case, that's one sort of thing that we've seen people thinking about and talking about. Another thing that we're now seeing people thinking about and talking about is egg freezing. Now, this is something that I did 2 years ago. I did this right before I left New York City, right before I moved back here for this job at Channel 3 here in Cleveland. And what we are seeing now is that fertility clinics across the country, according to the Today Show, are reporting that they're seeing an increase in new patients for egg freezing and also for other fertility procedures, but egg freezing. Now, it is noted, though, some of this might be simply because people had planned to do it and they had to wait because clinics were closed down. Anything that wasn't deemed to be essential, right, sort of stopped for a good period of time here at the beginning of this pandemic. So part of it is that. But doctors are also saying that this is sort of a motivating factor for a new group of patients. Now, when I did this 2 years ago, I documented the whole thing on my Instagram page. You can see it on my Instagram Reels. It's also on my YouTube page. And I'm so glad that I did it. And the reason that I wanted to share it with everyone is because for me, the scariest part about egg freezing was not knowing really what to expect, not knowing what it was about, not knowing how long it would take, all the questions, not knowing what my prospects were of being able to naturally have a child. Because, you know, as someone who's in their mid-30s, I was getting a little bit nervous about the ability to be able to have a child naturally. So I was looking at this as sort of an insurance policy. So what we're going to talk about as we talk about egg freezing, we'll be talking about it in 3 different ways. First, today, we'll be talking about what to consider before you even decide to go through with egg freezing, some testing that you might want to get done. We'll get into a little bit more on that in just a minute. And then next week, we'll talk about the actual process and really walk through the nuts and bolts of everything that goes into it once you do decide to freeze your eggs and move forward with that. And then finally, we'll talk about some other concerns, some long-term concerns, some payment concerns, because it ain't cheap. I'll tell you that. And there's different incentives out there now. We're sort of seeing maybe a cultural shift in insurance policies. We'll take a look at that. And I also want to talk about some important legal considerations, because we do sort of talk about egg freezing in the space of a single woman who wants to preserve her fertility, but there is a case to be made as well, even if you're in a committed relationship, for freezing your eggs versus freezing embryos, which are fertilized eggs. And that's where another person sort of gets brought into the process. Now, we're not going to get too into the weeds on that right now. We're going to talk about that in a separate episode, something that's very important to me. I feel very passionate about it, specifically with my legal background, something I think it's very important for us to talk about. But today, what we're talking about are the considerations before you go into freezing your eggs. Now, I did this, like I said, 2 years ago. When I started the process, I was 33. When I wrapped it up, I was 34. And that was sort of I call it my scary age, because I was thinking, you know, we get all this information about how much more difficult it is to get pregnant naturally as you get older. And I found myself, you know, I was single. I was thinking about my future, knowing that I wanted to have kids, but the timing wasn't right, and decided that freezing my eggs was probably the best approach at that time. Here's something that we hear a lot about in the medical world. If you get pregnant at the age of 35 or later, that's considered a geriatric pregnancy. Geriatric. Think about that word. When we hear the word geriatric, we're thinking of older Americans, right? You might think of a person in a nursing home. Well, in the medical world, getting pregnant at 35 is a geriatric pregnancy. Now, that makes a pregnancy high risk. There are a lot of reasons for that, but what we are going to focus on is the ability to actually get pregnant, because that's what this is all about, aside from all of the other considerations at play if you do decide to go forward with having a child beyond the age of 35 and carrying that baby yourself. Because if you go through egg freezing, you do also have options like surrogacy. But if you decide to carry that baby by yourself at 35 or higher, the risk of pregnancy loss is higher, which is another reason why egg freezing might be something for people to consider before they get to that point. So what we'll be talking about today is who is doing this, why they're doing it, and what makes someone a good candidate for egg freezing. So we'll get into those details, and our guest today to talk us through all of this, couldn't have asked for a better guest. We have the director of the in vitro fertilization program at the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Marjan Attaran, joining us today to give us the lowdown on all of these details, the different kind of testing that's available to determine if you might even be successful with egg freezing, because like I said, it ain't cheap. Nobody wants to go through that process and not end up with eggs to freeze. So we're going to get you all in the know on that right now, and to do that, we'll bring in Dr. Attaran. Let's do that right now. Dr. Attaran, thank you so much for being with us today on the Three Things to Know podcast.
Thank you for having me today.
What we're getting into today is really just a broad overview of the egg freezing process. I know we'll have another conversation as well about the actual nuts and bolts of the procedure, but today what we want to do is really kind of paint the picture of where this falls into the broader IVF world. Can you tell us very quickly how egg freezing falls into that world?
Generally speaking, people have been doing IVF for the purpose of infertility. They have difficulty trying to conceive and perhaps have been diagnosed with a specific problem that has led them down into the in vitro fertilization world. The egg freezing process now is applying mostly to women who are thinking about preserving their fertility. They're thinking about their fertility in the future. Although a lot of this information has originally come from women who donated their eggs.
Okay. And just to clarify this for people who might not realize this, can you tell us what's the difference between an egg and an embryo?
Sure. So an egg lives in your ovary and has been present there really from the time of conception, okay? Versus an embryo is when the egg and the sperm fertilize each other and then begin to grow. And so now an embryo is created. It's just a whole new entity compared to an egg.
Okay, so our eggs, as a person here who has been born with eggs, I've had them my whole life, I've got eggs. If I'm going to have an embryo, there's another person involved in that process, right? It's not just me.
You're saying it far more eloquently than me.
Speaking it really plainly, you know, it's easy when you're trying to think about what it means at the same time. And so, as you said, we're getting a lot of this information from people who did egg donation to help other people maybe make babies who were having difficulty doing it with their own eggs and that sort of thing. But now we're talking about people who are choosing to freeze their eggs. That's something that I've done. I did it 2 years ago for exactly that reason, to preserve my fertility options. What kinds of people are you seeing that are choosing to make this choice and freeze their eggs? Is this a lifestyle choice? Is this an age thing? What do you think is happening there?
They are people exactly like you, young professional women, educated, and are currently, in many instances, they just haven't found the correct partner yet. It's sometimes because financially they're not at a point where they can potentially raise a child. But in the majority of cases, it's lack of the partner, and perhaps they're in the middle of their education and their career path.
So really in a situation here where for a lot of people, in a great scenario, you're preserving your options for the future. Now, let's talk about the science aspect of it. Who is a good candidate for egg freezing?
Mm-hmm. So, scientifically, I think what most women are surprised to realize is that we are born with all of our eggs that we're ever going to have. So very different than men. And so theoretically, the younger you are when you decide to preserve your eggs, the better off you are in terms of the probability of being able to walk away with a live born baby. And you would probably need less number of eggs frozen the younger you are compared to the older you are. But of course, the issue is, do you really know what the future has to hold for you? Do you know if in 2 years from now, Stephanie, that you are going to meet the man of your dreams or whoever your partner is going to be? And do you know that, right? Because we don't also want you to waste your time and energy and money and take any risks. So that's the difficulty of a young woman trying to make this decision. And when should she actually do this?
Mm-hmm. This is something in looking at egg freezing that we do hear a lot, that the younger eggs are better than the older eggs, so to speak. Why is that?
So it's the same thing as when you look at yourself physically speaking. Why do I run faster at age 20 than I'm going to run faster than at age 60? I mean, it is a cell. The egg is a cell. The 20-year-old egg is far less likely to have chromosomal problems than the 40-year-old egg is. Okay.
So fascinating. Another fascinating thing that I just want to touch on very quickly, and this is something that, we're doing a lot of work on here in the Cleveland Clinic with the uterus and how the uterus doesn't really age. It sort of blew my mind looking into some science behind this, that if you choose to freeze your eggs, you can actually carry your own child in the future through the IVF process, even after menopause. That is fascinating.
Yes. But again, like with anything in the body, you have to be careful. Yes, your eggs are better, your uterus, everything is better the younger you are, right? Because it's just younger. That's it. And true, we're kind of in a box, and everything is sort of dependent on this egg. But even the uterus, remember, as we get older, we have other medical issues that can pop up. We can have fibroids, we can have adenomyosis. So not every uterus is equivalent, right? We can typically address those and fix the problem, but it's not necessarily the same uterus at age 50 as it is at age 18.
That's true. That's an excellent point there. Definitely lots of things to consider here. Now, as someone who has been through this process, the scariest part for me was really the lack of knowledge of what it was going to be like, and the lack of knowledge of what my chances were, as I got older and older, my chances of being able to conceive naturally, if I wanted to wait until I was in the perfect romantic situation for that to happen, the perfect partnership. And so the testing element is very interesting to me. And if you're going to go through the egg freezing process, there is testing that you can do to sort of kind of see what your success might be, because it's not cheap. It's definitely a commitment. And with any medical procedure, there are also, risks to be considered as well. And so let's talk a little bit about the testing that's available to sort of determine how successful you might be if you decide to look into egg freezing. The first thing I want to talk about is the ultrasound that can be done to count the antral follicles. Can you tell us about antral follicles and what that sort of testing reveals?
Sure. So the antral follicle count is essentially the number of follicles that you see when an ultrasound is performed on these ovaries. And what's important for our patients to understand is that this count is not always a steady count, okay? So you get a generality that she's got greater than 10 follicles, or she's got greater than 20 follicles. But the point is that this antral follicle has the microscopic egg in it. And if you see the follicle, the hope is that this follicle will respond to the drugs that she will be taking to grow her eggs, okay? Sometimes it's not this perfect relationship, however. And so because of that, there's many different types of ovarian reserve testing that has been thought of and used throughout the years. So another one that is more commonly used even than the antral follicle count is the anti-Mullerian hormone test. So just again, going back to physiology, you have a follicle, and when it is a small follicle, there's a lot of granulosa cells that are in there, and those granulosa cells are supporting the microscopic egg that's in the follicle. Those granulosa cells are producing anti-Mullerian hormone. So if the anti-Mullerian hormone is a higher number, it typically seems to indicate that there are more follicles that are present in this individual, and that hopefully she will respond better to the medications.
Okay, and the anti-Mullerian hormone level, or AMH as it's often shortened to, this can be determined in a blood test?
Yes, it can. You are correct.
Okay, and these follicles are happening just every month, right? That's how it works. What happens with these follicles? How often does a follicle mature into an egg that we actually ovulate? How does that work?
Yes. Yeah, so this is something that, as in most things in medicines, has become more and more complex, So in medical school, we're taught that, there's a batch of follicles that is growing every month. And out of this batch of follicles, one follicle becomes dominant and reaches about 18, 20 millimeters in size. And then it gets the right signals and it releases the mature egg. And so when we're doing in vitro fertilization, that batch of follicles they're all recruited, right? So it could be 20 follicles that start growing when you give the correct medication. And I would say within the past decade, even that thought process has been modified to the point where we feel that there's waves of follicles that are growing constantly so that you can catch and develop the growth of these eggs at multiple times during this 28-day cycle, the classic 28-day cycle, not just traditionally right at the beginning of the stimulation or the beginning of the cycle. Does that answer the question?
It does. It's fascinating to me that we've just got, sort of these waves of follicles growing. Some of them grow large enough to be an egg that could potentially mature into a pregnancy, and some of them don't. And the ones that don't, what do they just kind of evaporate? What happens to those ones?
They undergo atresia. So they essentially die off or undergo apoptosis is the other word for it. But yeah, neither you nor I are aware of it. And the cycle continues.
Fascinating. Our bodies are just mystifying in the things that they do. They really are.
Yes. You can't be doing this without having a massive, massive appreciation for the complexity of the body and the way it controls every single thing that's happening at whatever your field happens to be, which mine happens to be this. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
It really is, and so fascinating. Now, we're talking about this testing that people can do to sort of see what their success might be if they want to do egg freezing. I want to talk about the AMH testing in a little bit more detail. What kind of a number are you wanting to see there for someone who might be a very successful egg freezing candidate?
Mm-hmm. So as in most things in medicine, you want a middle number. You don't want an incredibly high number and you don't want an incredibly low number. So probably the numbers that are comfortable are, and again, it depends on the laboratory that's performing this particular test, because there are different assays. And so there are different levels of what's considered low or high. But within our lab system, I would say numbers between 2 and 6, 2 and 7 are nice middle of the range numbers where we're feeling pretty good about the ability to retrieve multiple eggs from the woman who's undergoing this process.
Okay, so I want to share a little bit about my personal experience with this because I know people like to have hard and fast examples, and this was something that was mind-blowing to me. I did this about 2 years ago, and I thought I was going to be able to just show up and be like, all right, I'm ready to start this process, and it would be done very quickly. But that was not the situation that I had, because when I went in for my initial diagnostic testing, this is when I was living in New York, so not here in Ohio, we did the ultrasound to check the number of antral follicles. We did the blood test to check my AMH level, and this is after I had stopped taking birth control for about 2 weeks because I had done some reading and I had seen that that was recommended, which makes sense. If you're trying to freeze some eggs, maybe you stop the birth control. So my AMH level was quite low. It was 0.52. And as we've just said, something in the middle between 2 and 7 might show that you might be successful with having a large number or multiple eggs to freeze. My follicle count was 9. So as you can imagine, I was quite disappointed in those numbers. So I waited. February I went back. That AMH level went up to 1.49. I stayed off birth control this entire time. Then I went back again in June. I still thought, I want to see if that goes up anymore. So it did go up a little bit more. It went up to 1.82 before I eventually had my procedure. And, it worked out for me. I ended up being able to freeze 8 eggs, which I felt okay about. And we'll talk about that more when you come back for our second episode. But all of that to say, we do hear that maybe birth control can have an impact on egg freezing, and people might want to go off birth control maybe for a little bit longer, definitely more than 2 weeks before you go into the office, I would say, based on my experience. What do you think about that, Dr. Attaran?
Well, this is an area that is evolving. So initially when the AMH was introduced as one of the ovarian reserve testing, its value was that you can do it at any time of the cycle, and that it's not really impacted by any kind of hormonal therapy that you might be under. But then as time went by, we saw that there were individuals who they are something that we say they have what's called hypothalamic amenorrhea. So that means their brains are not secreting LH and FSH to the same extent as somebody who has regular periods. Okay, so somebody who maybe is a significant athlete and doesn't get any periods, there's a bit of suppression that's happening at the level of the pituitary. And so we started noticing that their AMH levels were lower than what you'd expect to be, right? And so then the thought was, well, but they probably have the eggs. It's just that the eggs are not sitting in that antral follicle mode, right? The eggs are sitting in a stage before that. And so I just explained to you where the AMH is actually coming from. And so that's what I think then led us to further observations about, could it be that somebody who's been on 15 years of birth control pills, which is very different than just 2 years of birth control pills, okay? Could that be a different person where there's actually suppression of that same LH FSH at the level of pituitary because of that long duration? And so now I don't know that everybody is completely convinced of this suppression, but it's definitely worth it to, if you see unexpectedly in a young woman that her AMH level is low and she hasn't even been trying to get pregnant, to consider coming off the birth control pill like you did.
Okay.
And just assess it in 6 months' time and see what does it look like.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting phenomenon to go on. I should go back and do an AMH test again now, because I've stayed off birth control since then. I'm at the age where it's recommended that you not really be on it anyway past this point. And I'd like to see where it is now. That's an interesting idea. I might just for curiosity to see what's happened.
Yes. Because I don't think I've actually seen a study where, they've said, here it is, 30 people, AMHs of 0.5. They all were on 15 years of birth control pills. 3 years later, what's their AMH?
Mm-hmm.
That would be sort of definitive, and I haven't seen anything like that.
Yeah, and that is pretty much exactly my situation. Been on it for a very long time. I'd say probably about 15 years. It's been about 2.5 years that I've been off it now. So if that study happens, sign me up. I'm in there. I'll be the test case. Right. That is something that I do. That brings me to another topic, though, I want to discuss here. You had mentioned as well that some of the data that we have about, the egg freezing information comes from women who have done egg donation, which is people are, offering up their eggs, for lack of better words, for people who aren't able to have children naturally on their own. And so that does sort of beg the question, how telling is this data? Because presumably I'm thinking it's possible that somebody might have that low AMH level and they've just never had a problem having children, so they're not getting the testing. But now we see the people doing this testing sort of as like a preventative measure or trying to preserve the fertility. So how much weight I guess the question is, how much weight do we give that AMH level if we're doing this testing to consider egg freezing? How much weight do we give those ultrasounds that show the antral follicle counts?
So I think maybe I'm going to turn the question into, because I feel very strongly about this particular issue, is if I incidentally, like in your case, find out that your AMH is 0.5 and you never actually even tried to get pregnant, there's no way that I'm going to ever tell you you're going to have a hard time getting pregnant on your own.
Okay.
And I feel like that's like and this takes me to, you may have this probably up your sleeve that you're going to ask me anyway, but there's these tests out there that people are taking,
Yes.
And they walk in the door and they say, my AMH was blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, stop freaking out, because you haven't even had a month of attempting pregnancy. You're maybe on the brink of a relationship. And now you have this extra information that means nothing whatsoever. But because IVF and egg freezing has a lot of different risks associated with it, then before you spend all your money on this, you do want to know, will you grow eggs or not? And that's the only value of the AMH as far as I'm concerned. Do you want to spend this amount of money and not respond at all? Then let's do this AMH level on you.
Okay. Yes, that was exactly my question, because something that we see, and maybe I'm just seeing it because I find this topic very fascinating. I had documented my whole egg freezing process, but I see these Instagram ads and all of these influencers talking about doing these tests to check their ovarian reserve. And I'm just wondering, do those work?
Yeah, I think it honestly just adds massive anxiety to young women who are understandably worried and see the future in a certain light that they should, but perhaps their life isn't there yet, right? And it just honestly makes me sad. It makes me sad that people go out there and get all this extra info that is worrisome to them.
As someone who is prone to a certain level of anxiety, that definitely resonates with me. When I walked out of that doctor's office and I had a 0.52 AMH level, I was like, oh, crushing gut punch. Thankfully, being the type of person I am, I just decided to stick with it because I'm very into the details and all of the analytics and stuff. So I can pretty much guarantee you that I probably will get another AMH test just to see what happened, just because.
Yes.
But the truth, go on.
The truth, though, is now you are educated, right? Mm-hmm. And you're going to look at it from a different perspective. For me, it's the person that doesn't have as much information. It's just one data point. What do I do with it? And somebody in a blog said something, so yeah, don't cause more pain for yourself. That's what I'm trying to say.
And at the end of the day, it only takes one. It only takes one work.
That is exactly right. That is right.
All right, Dr. Attaran, thank you so much for covering this part of it. Again, the point of this conversation were the considerations if you decide, or you're trying to decide if you want to go into egg freezing. When Dr. Attaran joins us again, we'll be talking about the actual process once you've made the decision to go forward with egg freezing, which is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Attaran.
Thank you for your great questions.
Dr. Attaran makes so many great points here, and I really love how she reminds us that the AMH level, not the end-all be-all. I'll tell you, that was very upsetting for me personally when I went in for that first appointment back in December of 2018, and I learned my AMH level was 0.52. Like I had said when talking to the doctor, I'd only been off birth control for 2 weeks, but I was really expecting, here's, the part of not knowing what was to come comes into play. I was really expecting to go in there a couple of weeks before my cycle was supposed to start, get everything ironed out, get it done, and be done with this in a month. But that was not the case for me. Like I said, you can follow along my journey. I have it all documented on my Instagram page _Stephanie Haney and on my YouTube channel. And it's also linked on WKYC.com and in the show notes on this podcast. But yeah, that was a big shock for me. And I was very happy that it ended up going up in June. Like I said, I do think that I will get that AMH level retested just out of my own personal curiosity. And when I do that, I will let you guys know, because truly, at this point, I'm really an open book here. We might as well just all go through it together. Now, Dr. Attaran will be back with us next week to talk about the actual egg freezing process and the procedure. Once you've done all that work, you've done all your injections, you've grown all your eggs, and it's time to retrieve those eggs and then ultimately freeze them. So she'll be back with us next week to talk about that. Really looking forward to that conversation. And that brings us to what you need to know in Enio. And I feel like this is good brunch talk when you're out with your girlfriends, when you're out with whoever is in your group of friends, and we're talking about our lives, right? We're not just talking about celebrity gossip when we're out to brunch. We're talking about the important stuff that matters. So I want to share with you a great brunch spot. It's a pretty new spot. It's in downtown Cleveland. It's called Betts, and it's at the Schofield Hotel. That's at the corner of Euclid and East 9th here in downtown Cleveland. It is pretty new. It actually opened during the pandemic, which is a challenging thing to do, but they did it. It's a beautiful space. They were actually one of the early places to have those cool little greenhouse outdoor dining style things. Now it's warming up, so we won't necessarily need those as much, but maybe they'll keep them around so that people can continue to distance. You never know, but they are very cute either way, and they've got a great menu. They have something for everyone. They have, of course, a full menu for people who like to eat meat and seafood and all of that, but it's also vegan friendly and keto friendly because a lot of people are very into the keto nutrition plan. And they have everything marked on their menu too, which I always appreciate. And very creative combinations and things going on at Betts. If you want to check them out on Instagram to see just how cute the space is, you can find them on Instagram at eatatbetts. And it's with 2 T's, Betts. And that brings me to a good follow for this week. And I want to share with you a resource that was incredible for me. Like I had mentioned, I worked with Extend Fertility in Manhattan when I did my egg freezing, and they really are a good follow on Instagram. The account is just Extend Fertility. And just so you know, you're getting the good stuff here. This is the largest egg freezing practice in the country. They have a whole part of their practice that's devoted solely to egg freezing, and you just don't really see that in a lot of places. A lot of places kind of do egg freezing on the side of an IVF practice. So very focused on that, and they explained complicated things very, very clearly. They've got great graphics. It's very visual. They actually used this gumball machine recently to sort of depict how our egg reserve changes as we get older, because as you know, we are born with all the eggs that we're ever going to have. And they do great explanations on the AMH level and what that means and how that rolls into it, just in case you want to get a visual representation of the things that we talked about today. Another thing that I love about Extend Fertility is they share all kinds of facts. They don't just share the facts about the female reproductive system. They do share facts about the male reproductive system as well, because the way things currently stand, if you want to make a baby, we do still need sperm. Can't do it without that. You gotta have an egg, you gotta have sperm, you gotta make the embryo, and you gotta go from there. So it's good to have that information too about how all of that works and the interplay with those things. And so that is why Extend Fertility is a good follow if this is something that you're interested in. Okay, that's it for this week's 3 Things to Know. Thank you so much for being here. Come back next week. We will talk about the actual process of egg freezing, share information about that, and what you can expect if it's something that you're thinking about going through, or if it's something that someone in your life is going through, because it's always helpful to have that shared perspective, right? So that we can understand where people are coming from. And that's it for this week. I will see you back here next week. Between now and then, I would love it if you would share the podcast if you found this interesting, leave me a rating and a review, and send me a DM if you do so that we can talk about it. I'll see you back here then. I'm Stephanie Haney.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.